Rachel's voice trembles as she begins, unburdening a secret long buried, a wound she's carried in silence, pleading for understanding before judgment. Her story, raw and haunting, unfolds with the weight of years, a memory that clings like a shadow, reshaping her life in ways she never imagined. She and John, her husband of nearly a decade, had built a life together, woven with the ordinary threads of love, laughter, and occasional strife. Their marriage, like many weathered storms, moments of joy eclipsed by fleeting arguments, yet always anchored by a shared commitment. But time, subtle and insidious, began to unravel the man she thought she knew. John, once warm, attentive, and steadfast, grew distant, his affection replaced by a cold, unfamiliar edge. His smiles faded, his words sharpened, and a controlling undertone crept into their daily life. Rachel, ever hopeful, dismissed it as the strain of his demanding job, a temporary cloud over their bond. Deep within, however, unease stirred, a quiet alarm that something was profoundly wrong. She clung to memories of their early days, when love felt effortless, hoping this shift was a phase they could navigate together. Yet, the man who once held her hand through life's uncertainties now seemed a stranger, his gaze carrying a weight she couldn't decipher. That evening, as they sat down to dinner, John's demeanor was unsettling, a forced cheerfulness masking something darker. Rachel sensed the air shift, her heart quickening with an instinct that whatever was coming would alter everything. Her story, she warns, is not one of simple choices, but of a spiral she never saw coming, a betrayal that would test the very core of who she was and who she could become. Rachel's heart pounded as she sat across from John at the dinner table, the clink of dishes fading into an oppressive silence, her mind still reeling from the ordinary rhythm of their evening. The dim glow of the chandelier cast long shadows, and John's face, usually a map of familiar expressions, now held something alien, a glint in his eyes that sent a shiver down her spine. He had come home that night with an energy she couldn't place, a forced buoyancy that felt less like joy and more like a prelude to something unsettling. She pushed her plate away, her appetite gone, sensing the air thicken with the weight of what he was about to say. John set his fork down, his movements deliberate, and leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly, as if anchoring himself for what was to come. "Rachel," he began, his voice low, measured, "I've been thinking about us, about our life." Her pulse quickened, her fingers tightening around the edge of her napkin, bracing for a conversation she hadn't anticipated. She nodded, her throat dry, urging him to continue, hoping for something benign, perhaps a suggestion of a weekend away, a chance to rediscover the spark that had once defined them. But John's next words landed like a blow, shattering the fragile hope she clung to. "I want to try something new," he said, his eyes flickering away from hers, avoiding the weight of her gaze. "I've arranged for 2 men to come over this weekend." The room seemed to tilt, the walls closing in as Rachel's mind struggled to process his words. 2 men. The phrase hung in the air, stark and incomprehensible, like a foreign language she couldn't translate. Her breath caught, her stomach twisting into knots as she stared at him, searching for a hint of jest, a crack in his serious facade. But his expression was unyielding, his jaw set, his eyes now fixed on the table, as if he couldn't bear to meet her disbelief. "What do you mean, 2 men?" she managed, her voice barely a whisper, trembling with a mix of confusion and dread. John leaned back, his attempt at nonchalance failing to mask the tension in his shoulders. "They're friends," he said, his tone too casual, too rehearsed. "People I know, people we can trust. We'll spend the evening together. All of us." Rachel's hands shook, her napkin crumpling in her grip, as the implications of his words sank in. This wasn't a romantic getaway, not a couple's retreat, or a counseling session to mend their fraying bond. This was something else entirely, something that felt like a violation of everything they had built. Her mind raced, replaying the years of their marriage, the vows they'd exchanged, the quiet moments of intimacy that had once felt sacred. How could he suggest this? As if it were a simple change of routine, like trying a new restaurant or redecorating the living room. The betrayal cut deeper than she could articulate, a sharp, visceral pain that made her chest ache. She felt sick, her body rebelling against the very idea, her heart screaming that this wasn't the man she'd married. John, the man who had once held her through sleepless nights, who had promised to cherish her, was now proposing something that felt like a desecration of their love. "John, are you serious?" she asked, her voice rising, cracking under the weight of her emotions. "This isn't us. This isn't what we do." Her words tumbled out, a mix of anger and desperation, as she tried to reach the man she thought she knew. But John's face hardened, his eyes narrowing, and he cut her off with a sharpness that stunned her. "Rachel, this is happening," he said, his tone cold, authoritative, as if her consent was irrelevant. "This is what I want, what we need." The word need struck her like a slap, its audacity leaving her breathless. Need? What they needed was trust, communication, a return to the love that had once bound them, not this grotesque parody of intimacy. She shook her head, her hands trembling as she pushed back from the table, her chair scraping against the floor. "No, John," she said, her voice steadier now, fueled by a growing resolve. "I won't do this. This isn't right." But John didn't relent. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a low, insistent pitch, as if he could will her into compliance. "Rachel, you don't understand," he said, his words laced with a strange mix of urgency and frustration. "This isn't about you. It's about us, about keeping things alive." Alive? The irony burned, as their marriage felt like it was suffocating under the weight of his demand. She wanted to scream, to shake him, to demand how he could equate this with love, with partnership. Instead, she sat frozen, her mind a whirlwind of betrayal and disbelief. The man she loved, the man she had built a life with, was unraveling before her, replaced by someone who saw her as a means to an end, a pawn in some twisted fantasy. She thought of their early days, the way John's laughter had filled their small apartment, the way his touch had once felt like home. That man was gone, and in his place was someone who spoke of friends and evenings together with a chilling detachment. Rachel's eyes stung with unshed tears, but she refused to let them fall, not in front of him. She stood, her legs unsteady, and took a step back, needing distance from the man who was dismantling her world. "John, this is insane," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "You're asking me to betray everything we are, everything I am." His response was a sigh, heavy and impatient, as if her resistance was a minor inconvenience. "Rachel, you're making this harder than it needs to be," he said, rubbing his temples, his frustration palpable. "I've already set this up. They're coming, and you need to be on board." The finality in his voice, the dismissal of her feelings, ignited a spark of anger within her. She wasn't a child to be coerced, not a possession to be directed. She was his wife, his partner, and yet he treated her as if her voice didn't matter, as if her boundaries were negotiable. The days that followed were a blur of tension, a slow descent into a nightmare she couldn't wake from. John's insistence grew, his demeanor shifting from manipulative persuasion to cold indifference. He came home late, his whereabouts vague, his responses clipped. The warmth that had once filled their home was replaced by a suffocating silence, a void where love used to be. Rachel felt like a stranger in her own life, trapped between the man she loved and the reality of what he was becoming. She considered leaving, packing a bag and walking away, but the weight of their shared history held her back. 10 years of memories, of laughter and tears, of promises made and kept, tethered her to the hope that this was a momentary lapse, a storm they could weather. Yet, with each passing day, that hope dimmed, replaced by a growing dread as the weekend loomed closer. By Friday, the reality of John's plans settled like a stone in her chest. She lay awake at night, staring at the ceiling, replaying his words, searching for a way out. She thought of confronting him again, of begging him to see reason, but his resolve was unyielding, his mind made up. The thought of those men, strangers in her home, in her marriage, made her skin crawl. She imagined their faces, their voices, their presence invading the space she had once called safe. She wanted to run, to disappear, but the fear of losing everything, her home, her marriage, the life she had known, kept her rooted. She hated herself for that hesitation, for the part of her that still loved John, that still believed he could change. But as Saturday drew near, the truth became undeniable. This wasn't about love, not anymore. It was about control, about John's need to dictate, to reshape their marriage into something that served only him. Rachel stood at the edge of a precipice, her heart torn between loyalty and self-preservation, her mind screaming that she deserved better than this betrayal. The weekend was coming, and with it, a choice that would define her future. She didn't know if she could face it, didn't know if she could find the strength to say no, but one thing was clear. The man she loved was slipping away, and she wasn't sure she could follow him into the darkness he was creating. Rachel's world felt like it was collapsing, the air in their home heavy with a tension that clung to every surface, every glance. The days following John's shocking proposal were a descent into a quiet, suffocating dread, each moment pulling her further from the life she thought she knew. John had changed, his warmth replaced by a cold determination, his words sharp and dismissive, as if her refusal was a personal affront. He barely spoke to her now, his presence in their home reduced to fleeting, tense encounters, his eyes avoiding hers, his responses curt. Where once their evenings were filled with shared laughter, now silence reigned, broken only by the occasional clink of a glass or the distant hum of the television. Rachel tried to reach him, to bridge the growing chasm, but every attempt was met with indifference, a wall she couldn't scale. She told herself this was temporary, a phase born of stress or some unspoken crisis, but deep down, she knew the truth was darker. John wasn't just distant, he was resolute, his mind fixed on the weekend, on the plan that made her stomach churn. By Thursday, the weight of his insistence pressed against her chest, a constant reminder of the approaching storm. She had said no, repeatedly, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and defiance, but John dismissed her objections as if they were trivial. He came home late each night, his excuses vague, his demeanor unyielding. "I was out," he'd say, brushing past her questions, leaving her to wonder where he went, who he saw. The love that had once filled their home was gone, replaced by a cold, oppressive silence that made her feel like an intruder in her own life. She wandered their house, touching familiar objects, the coffee mug he'd bought her on their honeymoon, the framed photo of them laughing at a festival, searching for traces of the man she married. But those traces were fading, overwritten by this new John, a man who spoke of needs and plans with a chilling detachment. Rachel considered leaving, packing a bag and walking out the door, her mind racing with possibilities. She imagined driving to her sister's house, or checking into a hotel, anywhere but here, where every corner held a memory now tainted by betrayal. But something held her back, a stubborn thread of hope, a belief that the John she loved was still in there, buried beneath this madness. She wasn't ready to abandon their 10 years together, the life they'd built, the dreams they'd shared. Yet, with each passing hour, that hope felt more like a chain, binding her to a reality she couldn't accept. She lay awake at night, staring at the ceiling, her thoughts a whirlwind of fear and indecision. What if she stayed? What if she gave in? Would it save them, or would it destroy her? The thought of those men, strangers in her home, in her marriage, made her skin crawl, her heart pound with a visceral rejection of John's plan. Friday arrived, and the dread solidified, a heavy stone in her chest. John's insistence had only grown, his voice sharp, his patience thin. "It's happening, Rachel," he said that morning, his tone final, as if her consent was a formality he no longer needed. She wanted to scream, to shake him, to demand how he could do this to her, to them. But words failed her, swallowed by the fear of what came next. She spent the day in a haze, her hands trembling as she went through the motions of daily life, washing dishes, folding laundry, each task a desperate attempt to anchor herself. She thought of calling her best friend, Sarah, of pouring out her heart, but shame kept her silent. How could she explain this? How could she admit that her marriage had come to this? Saturday evening arrived too quickly, the clock ticking down like a countdown to her undoing. Rachel sat on the couch, her hands clenched in her lap, her nails digging into her palms as she tried to steady her breathing. The doorbell rang at 8 p.m., sharp and jarring, announcing the arrival of John's so-called friends. She froze, her body refusing to move, her mind screaming at her to run. The men entered, their voices low, their presence filling the room with an unbearable weight. They were ordinary, unremarkable, not the predators she'd imagined, but that only deepened her confusion. They greeted John warmly, as if this were a casual gathering, their ease a stark contrast to the turmoil raging inside her. She couldn't look at them, couldn't bear the thought of their eyes on her, assessing, waiting. The air was thick, suffocating, and she felt like a trapped animal, cornered in her own home. John sat beside her, his hand resting on her knee, a gesture that once brought comfort, but now felt like a shackle. "Rachel, it's time," he whispered, his voice low, insistent, carrying a trace of something she hadn't heard before. Desperation. She turned to him, searching his face for the man she loved, but found only a stranger, his eyes pleading yet unyielding. Her heart pounded, her mind a cacophony of fear and defiance. She wanted to stand, to scream, to tear herself away, but her body felt heavy, anchored by his touch, by the weight of their shared history. The room seemed to shrink, the walls closing in, the men's voices fading into a distant hum. She couldn't do this, couldn't let this happen, but the fear of losing everything, her marriage, her home, her identity, held her in place. "Rachel, please," John said again, his voice softer now, almost breaking, and for a moment she saw a flicker of vulnerability, a glimpse of the man she once knew. It wasn't just about his twisted desire, she realized. It was about power, about proving something to himself, to her. But that realization didn't make it right, didn't erase the betrayal, the violation of trust. "I can't, John," she whispered, her voice cracking, barely audible. "This isn't who we are." He sighed, his hand dropping from her knee, his frustration palpable as he rubbed his temples. "You think I want this?" he muttered, more to himself than to her. "I'm doing this for us, Rachel. Don't you see that?" His words were a twisted plea, a justification that rang hollow. She shook her head, finding a sliver of strength buried beneath her fear. "No, you're doing this for you," she said, her voice steady now, cutting through the tension. "This is about control, not us." For a moment, silence hung between them, heavy and fraught. John's jaw clenched, his eyes flashing with something like guilt, or perhaps anger, but it vanished quickly, replaced by a cold resolve. He stood, pacing the room, his movements restless, like a man lost in his own choices. Rachel's gaze flickered to the men across from her, one of them shifting uncomfortably, sensing the fracture in the room. "Look," he said, his voice calm but firm. "If this isn't happening, we should go." His words were unexpected, his tone almost respectful, and for the first time, Rachel looked at him, really looked. He wasn't what she'd feared, not a monster, just a man caught in a situation she didn't fully understand. That made it worse somehow, the normalcy of it all, the way this absurdity had invaded her life. She wanted to leave, to walk out and never look back, but the weight of her marriage, of 10 years of love and promises, kept her rooted. John's voice broke through her thoughts, quiet but resolute. "Rachel, if you don't do this, we're done." The words hit like a physical blow, stealing her breath, her vision blurring with unshed tears. She looked at him, searching for a trace of the man she loved, but found only a stranger. His face set, his words a ultimatum. "I've given you everything," he continued, his voice cold, "and this is all I'm asking." The manipulation was clear now, stark and undeniable, and it ignited a fire within her. She stood, her legs shaky but determined, her voice low but firm. "This isn't love, John," she said. "This is control." His eyes flashed, but she didn't falter, didn't let his anger silence her. She turned toward the door, her heart pounding, her resolve hardening with each step. She expected him to stop her, to yell, to grab her arm, but he didn't. Only a muttered, "You'll regret this," followed her, a final barb that couldn't pierce the strength she'd found. Rachel stepped into the cool night air, her breath catching, her body trembling with a mix of relief and heartbreak. She walked, her legs carrying her forward, away from the life she'd known, toward an uncertain future, but one she would define on her own terms. Rachel stepped into the night, the cool air a sharp contrast to the suffocating tension of her home, her breath visible in the dim streetlight, her heart a tangle of relief and sorrow. Each step away from John felt like a severance, a tearing of the life she'd known, yet also a fragile liberation, a reclaiming of herself. Her legs moved mechanically, carrying her through the quiet streets, her mind a storm of questions with no answers. Where would she go? What would she do? How could she rebuild from this betrayal? The weight of 10 years pressed against her, memories of love now tainted by John's ultimatum, his cold insistence that she bend to his will. She walked for what felt like hours, the city blurring around her, until she found herself at Sarah's doorstep, her best friend's home a beacon in the darkness. Her knock was tentative, her face streaked with tears she hadn't realized she'd shed. When Sarah opened the door, her eyes widened, but she asked no questions, only pulled Rachel into a fierce embrace, guiding her inside with a quiet strength that anchored her. In Sarah's living room, surrounded by the familiar comfort of worn cushions and soft lamplight, Rachel let the dam break, her words spilling out in fragments, the story of John's plan, his manipulation, her refusal. Sarah listened, her presence a lifeline, offering no judgment, only a hand to hold as Rachel navigated the wreckage of her marriage. Days passed in a haze, Rachel staying with Sarah, each moment a struggle to process the loss. She missed John, or rather the man he used to be, the one who'd laughed with her, held her, promised forever. But that man was gone, replaced by someone who saw her as a means to an end, a tool for his desires. The realization cut deep, yet it also clarified her path. She couldn't return, couldn't rebuild on a foundation cracked by coercion. John's calls came sporadically, his voicemails a jarring mix of apology and anger, his voice swinging between remorse and blame. "Rachel, I didn't mean it," he'd say in one, only to snap, "You're throwing everything away," in the next. She listened to each message, her heart aching, but didn't respond, knowing his words were a trap, a pullback to a life she could no longer live. Eventually, the calls stopped, the silence both a relief and a fresh wound. Months later, Rachel filed for divorce, the decision agonizing yet inevitable. Signing the papers felt like cutting away a part of herself. The years of love, the shared dreams, now reduced to legal documents. But it was also a release, a step toward a future where she could define her worth. Rebuilding was slow, deliberate, each day a small act of defiance against the pain. She found a small apartment, its walls bare but hers alone, a space to rediscover who she was without John's shadow. She returned to passions she'd let lapse, painting, reading, long walks where she could breathe freely. Therapy helped, a place to untangle the guilt, the what-ifs, the lingering love for a man who'd betrayed her. She thought of John sometimes, of the life they might have had if he hadn't changed, if trust had remained their cornerstone. But those thoughts no longer held her hostage. She deserved better, a love built on respect, not control, a partnership where her voice mattered. Rachel stood taller now, her scars a testament to her strength, her choice to walk away a declaration of self-worth. The heartbreak lingered, a quiet ache, but it no longer defined her. With Sarah's support, new friendships, and a renewed sense of purpose, she began to see a future untainted by betrayal. She was free, not just from John, but from the fear of losing herself. Her story, once a secret buried in shame, was now a beacon, a reminder that she could choose herself, and that choice was enough.